Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Trowel Talk Live. Today's talk by Marianne Van Berlo is all about transplants. Marianne is one of our more experienced master gardeners with one of the most beautiful gardens, I think, in the region. She has a wealth of information to share with you today. Also, just a quick reminder before we start that your questions can be typed into the chat box, and Marianne will try and answer them at the end of the talk. We will try to end at 1 o'clock. So that said, over to you, Marianne.
Thank you, Julianne. So we'll start with a pop quiz. What's the square root of tree? Well, hopefully it's not this. This is a great example of a poorly planted tree. So we want to avoid this at all costs. The root system of trees are actually very shallow. We have this idea that, or it's an old idea that tree roots mimic what you see above ground, but that's not the case. They actually radiate out from the tree trunk and are quite shallow. And when you start to see a failing tree, it's time to investigate what could be causing it. And this lady posted this picture and followed up with the autopsy of her tree. She dug it up to see why it was dying. And sure enough, it was still going round and round in the same shape as the pot, the nursery pot that it had been in for many years. So this starts from day one. The seed is started in a little peat pellet or a little plug, and they continue to grow that shape. They get potted up regularly, but the roots are going round and round. So what's the solution for that? Well, root washing and root pruning can help get your tree roots growing in a more natural form and improve the overall health of your tree. So in the first picture here, pop the little Japanese maple out of its pot. Some of the soil's fallen off already. And this one isn't too pot bound. So the next step is to try and get all that nursery soil off. And a good way to do that is to wash it. Sometimes you'll even have to get a hose and put some water pressure in to get in between the roots. I've left the stake on just to keep it a little more stable in this case, but that comes off a little later on. So you just continue to try and wash all the soil away so you can actually see the root structure. And in this photo, I've already cut one root, and I realized, oh, I better take a picture of this if I'm ever going to need this for a future presentation. And sure enough, I'm doing that right now. But what you want to do is prune out any roots that are going back into the center, crossing, girdling, or circling another root. So you want to encourage the roots to radiate out from the trunk like they would the spokes of a wagon wheel. And of course, you can't prune too many roots or you will jeopardize your tree. Probably the same rule of thumb for pruning a tree or shrub, never more than a third. And it's also very important to note the trunk flare on your tree. I'm sorry, the root flare. That is where the trunk and the roots, where the trunk flares out to the roots. It's where they meet, kind of. And you can see that's pointed out with the arrow here. Now, the old school of thought was that, you know, the nurseries, and they still tell you this, don't plant it any deeper than it is in the pot. And that assumes that it's the right depth in the pot. But I've received or bought many trees that were planted too deep in the pot. And that's because we don't know if the person planting it is a certified horticulturist or just a high school student who's doing this part-time. So you want to encourage those roots to grow outward. So you do some root pruning once you can see exactly what's going on. And it'd be naive of us to think that the roots that have been going round and round can magically straighten themselves out once you put the plant in the ground. They're not going to do that. And when you think about it, it's not a problem when that root mass is, whether all the roots are the size of your pinky. But once those roots get bigger, maybe to the size of your forearm, then it becomes a real problem because they're still in the same amount of space, but they're much larger. So they're going to start choking each other out. When you're ready for planting, well, actually your hole should be dug before you do all the root pruning and root washing. But if you haven't got your hole the right size, just make sure you leave the plant in water so that those roots aren't drying out. Prepare your hole. This, I know it doesn't capture well on a photo, but there is a hole here and then a mound of soil in the middle so that you can place the root over that mound of soil. And another old-fashioned thought was that we always said you should amend the soil, put some good manure or compost in there because you want to get that plant off to the best start possible. Well, that's not actually a good idea. Remember, we're trying to encourage the roots to grow outward. So it's like hosting a party and putting the smorgasbord or the buffet in the kitchen and then wondering why no one goes out to the living room to sit down where there's more space. It's because the food is where you left it, right in the middle of this clump or the hole that you made for this plant. So don't amend the soil. Get that plant used to growing in the resident soil. If anything, maybe just top dress the whole area with some manure compost that will seep in, and that will encourage the roots to go out towards that food also. Another reason you don't amend the soil in the dug hole and the backfill soil is because organic matter continually breaks down. And what you've now done is, after a few years, as that organic matter breaks down, you'll have a depression around your plant that will collect water. It will be a subtle depression, but it will definitely be there depending on how much organic matter you've put into it. As I said, much better to top dress the whole area and treat it all equally, because that's where the roots are going to be in a little while, out here, not just here. And once you've got it planted, your tree would benefit from some mulch. That will keep it, the moisture in the soil. It'll also eventually break down and feed the roots. But just remember, the mulch should not come in contact with the tree trunk. Remember, we talked about the trunk versus the root flare and the roots themselves? Well, see, there's the root flare just at soil level, and that's where it needs to be, because the trunk bark doesn't have the genetic makeup that allows it to sit in moisture. Roots have a different genetic makeup. They can sit in moist soil all the time. That's what they're meant to do. But the trunk itself will eventually rot if it's got mulch piled up around it or soil up against it. So do not do the mulch volcano that we see over here. That's just a sure way to cause problems for your tree. And this is kind of an old style planting. And of course, they're doing everything wrong in this one. They haven't checked for the root flare. It's still tied. The roots haven't been washed or spread out to radiate out from the plant. The hole's just deep and not wide enough to spread the roots out. I mentioned staking now. I realize I didn't mention that before. The current thought on staking is that you don't stake your trees unless absolutely necessary. Let's say you've got something that's really top heavy and is going to blow over and has a poor root system. Then you might stake it, but then again, you only want to stake it loosely. Science has shown us that trees actually spread their roots out more quickly when they are subject to a little swaying in the wind, because it's their natural defense to anchor themselves. And if you've tied it down, it's going up. I'm good. I don't need to do anything. So remember to remove the stake. All of these ties should come off. That will only choke your tree and impede its growth. And yes, as I said, just make sure that the root flare is above the soil level. And watering. A pet peeve of mine is seeing plants watered like this. What did we just say? We're radiating the tree roots outwards, there's no root ball there anymore. If we planted this tree properly, the roots should be out here, and we want to encourage them to grow out here. So this is where you should be watering. So just in summary of the tree planting itself, plant selection is very important. If you're looking at trees, I know sometimes we're tempted to buy the big, expensive one, but that's probably got really sturdy roots already that are going around in a circle. They will be harder to prune and straighten out. If you buy a young sapling, the roots still may be flexible enough that you can, straighten some of them out without doing a lot of pruning. When you're preparing the hole, if it's in a grassy area, remove the sod. If it's in a border already, obviously you don't have to do that. Make your hole wide, not deep. Then root wash and prune the roots to make sure you're going to give your tree the best start. Do not bury the root flare when you're planting it, and spread those roots out like a wagon wheel. Backfill with the resident soil. Don't amend it. We discussed that. Mulch is a good idea. As I said, it just keeps the moisture on, gives it a better chance. And water that tree thoroughly and regularly. The first year is critical for any tree, especially one that's had some root pruning done. It's got a smaller root system. It's going to need a little more TLC. And at the start, again, depending on the weather, you may need to water every second or third day, and then slowly reduce it to every fifth day, once a week. And then just go on right until fall, and make sure it gets a lot of water going into the fall. Winter, it's relying on its stores of food and water. And if it doesn't have as big a root mass, it doesn't have as big a store of food and water. And like I said, don't stake it unless it's top heavy, and then only stake it loosely if you must, and make sure you remove those stakes. Don't leave them on maybe for more than 6 months. And don't ever, leave them on forever, because it will girdle the tree. So for perennials, I actually started doing this about 4 years ago now. 2017 was a very wet year. It seemed to rain every second or third day. So I found out that I saw my plants were suffering. So what's going on here? They shouldn't be suffering. It's a really wet year. This is a year they should be doing really well. And I dug some up and found out that this peat-based soil was still very dry, even on a very wet year. And if you've ever had a planter dry out or a hanging basket, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Peat is actually hydrophobic, which means it repels water. So once it dries out, it's very hard to re-moisten. And I was finding when I dug up some of these plants that were suffering, that they still had a peat pellet around it. In fact, here's an example of one. And I actually I dug this up. As you can see, the heuchera was suffering badly. And then when I dug it up, I saw that there was still peat pellet on it. You can see it with the little arrows here. I started to tear it apart. Then I realized I should take a photo, but it was intact. And this soil in the middle here of a peat pot is pure peat, and it was bone dry. And as I said, the soil around it was moist, but the roots in that peat pot had already died because they were dry. And, the few little roots outside of the peat pot were trying to support the whole plant. So now when I get a heuchera like that, I will take it apart, and there's that little nasty peat pellet. So I would now take that peat pellet, take scissors and cut it open or rip it open, and make sure I get all the peat out of there. So just go through that step by step. About 10 days ago, I put this penstemon in my garden. There it is in its pot, took it out. Oh, wow, it's not too root bound. Flipped it over. Wow, it's root bound. Into its bath it goes to get that soil off. And sometimes you really have to work your fingers in there and squish it around a bit. Now, depending on your plant, they can be delicate, so do it as delicately as you can so that you're not breaking off your fresh growth. And there you can see I've got almost all the roots clean, but look, it's not a peat pellet in this case. It's actually the first pot that this penstemon was started in, whether it was grown as a seed or a cutting, who knows, but you can tell that it was, had gone through different sizes of pots, and this was the first one it was in, and it was a very tight mass of roots twisted around. So I did continue cleaning on that and got it right down to the basal plate. So this is looking up into the center of the roots. So all the soil's removed now. So I've got my hole prepared. And I know it doesn't look like a hole in the photo, but there is a hole here with a little mound of dirt in the middle. Again, this is the resident soil. I've moved the mulch back, dug my hole, put your plant in, drape those roots out around the little, the plant sitting on the mound of soil. And there it is, happy in its new home, mulch back in place. Everything looks like it's happy again, gave it a good watering, and 10 days later, it never wilted at all. So, no problem with transplant shock on this, despite what it just went through. A good tip is to always do your transplants either at the end of the day or on an overcast day. The best is to do it on end of the day when it's going to be an overcast day the next day, so it's not going through the stress of transplant and then sitting in the sun all day. Better yet, if you can do it when it's about to rain for a few days, but I know people work and you don't always have that luxury of just dropping everything and putting a plant in the ground. So try and work around it. If you can't, do it like that, then for a plant this size, you could just put a lawn chair in front of it to give it some artificial shade so that it's not got the sun beating down on it. And you're probably going, well, that's a waste of nursery soil. Well, just keep it, put it in a bag, put it in a big pot so that you have it available to you the next time you're digging up some plants for a friend or for your garden club's plant sale. Then you've got a good stock of potting soil on hand. And I know there's skeptics out there who are saying, my daddy taught me and his daddy taught him that you just put the tree in, you tease the roots and it's good. Well, a Google search will tell you that this is a real problem. There's all kinds of examples of girdle trees. And the problem is, as I said earlier, you don't see that it's a problem until maybe 10 years down the road after planting. Because when you plant it, the roots are tiny and they're not competing with each other. But as the tree grows, they start to compete with each other. And if they're all massed together in a tiny space, it will be a problem. Oh, yes, and I did want to mention that this has not been a problem for years and years. This is relatively a new problem because we didn't have container grown stock way back. So yes, all trees were grown, field grown. They were dug up, balled and burlapped. And then, you would put them in the ground. So yes, there was definitely, well, I guess it was root pruning that was done when they were dug up. So there was definitely some root damage, but they weren't growing around in circles like they would in a container. So definitely, I mean, if you're still skeptical and something dies on you, then it's time to do a plant autopsy, dig it up and see maybe what caused the tree or plant to fail. Was it the root system? and quite often it is. So now we're ready for some questions and answers. Oh, and I did want to mention before Josie looks in the chat to see what questions there are, that I know that was a lot of information. So if you need to, you can certainly go back to our YouTube channel and watch it again and just get a better idea of some of the facts that I covered there.
Okay, well, we have a few questions here. The first one I think has been pretty much answered, that these concepts apply to basically trees, shrubs, and perennials. And what about annuals and veggies? Should we also be washing the roots when planting those?
That's not as necessary because their growing season is so short. I mean, I have done it. It's because I'm really not a fan of peat-based soils, but for annuals that you're putting in a planter, you're just putting them in more peat-based soil. So to me, that would be a waste of time. But for veggies where you want them to grow and grow well in your native soil, it wouldn't hurt to do some, take away some of that peat-based soil and get them in contact with your resident soil right away.
Okay, thank you. And somebody is asking for a more precise definition of root flare.
Oh, well, the trunk is generally straight down, and then where it widens to the roots, that would be the root flare. So it's pretty definitive when you see it. So it's, I mean, I don't want to use the word flare, it's just where it widens out into the roots.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And somebody else, somebody else is asking a question which could be important for a number of people and communities about the size, the best size of tree to use when you're doing community planting, for example. And some people want to get smaller trees with maybe bare roots, and others want larger ones in pots. And can you recommend the best size?
Well, for me, I personally would go with the smaller tree every time. It's going to establish much more quickly because it's not going to be root bound. It's going to be much more able to adapt to the native soil more quickly. And it cuts down on the cost, obviously, too. Now, the trade-off is that you don't have an instant tree, but I think in the long run, it will grow more quickly and catch up.
Okay, thank you. And here's the question about the coral bells heaving. As you know, they tend to come up out of the ground. What can anything be done about that?
They are prone to it. And I do find I have seen a reduction in that since I did start root washing and making sure that they didn't have that peat pellet. So that will definitely help, but you still have to go around in the spring and check them because they do heave in frost.
So you would just replant it a bit deeper?
Yes, definitely. I mean, if the soil's really moist and soft in early spring, you can probably just push it back in. But if it's like right now, the soil's already dry, at least it is in my garden. So you physically have to get a shovel or a trowel and just push it, like dig it in a bit further deeper.
And I have a question about, you talked about staking loosely, perhaps might be necessary. Now, are we talking about a stick right onto the trunk, or are we talking about guy wires going out and attached fairly low down, about 2-3 feet on the trunk?
Definitely the latter, because very good point. All of those pictures showed the nursery stake, which of course was right up against the trunk, and you would never do that because that would impede the tree's growth. So yes, you would put your stake a few feet out, and always better to stake low rather than high, because then in less chance of it snapping off in high winds. And loosely just means so that there is some play in it. Like if you give the tree a bit of a shake, it's not going to go a foot over, but it could go a couple inches over.
Thank you. Okay, and what about square versus round hole? When
Oh,
that's come up recently, I see online.
okay. Well, I don't think that matters. It really depends on the root growth. And one thing, I was planting a bare root tree that I got from mail order last fall, and it had two main roots, and the roots actually extended further than the hole I dug. And so I'm like thinking, okay, do I take more sod off? Well, and what I ended up doing was just using my shovel and cutting a slit in the sod, putting the root in that slit, putting the sod back down. But then I put a little stake there, so I knew where those two main roots were, and that's where I was doing my watering. There was no point watering the other areas because they didn't actually have roots yet. But I knew where the roots were, so I was able to precision water.
Thank you. Now this question, there are 4 small branches sticking out of the ground from around our blue spruce trunk. So I assume it was planted too deep. Should we cut those branches?
Spruce are interesting trees. In some cases, they will the lower branches will root. I mean, I have seen it happen. So it might be thus that they were sitting on the ground and now they've rooted and are coming back up and trying to make little trees of their own. It depends on the look you're going for. It won't hurt it to have them there. But I mean, obviously, if it grows into a full-size tree, it will be too crowded. But if it's just a skirt and you like that look, then I'd leave it. Otherwise, you could certainly remove it if you want to.
Okay. I'm not sure how our time is going, but there were a couple of questions that weren't really about planting. Although this last one here, maybe, would you recommend planting fruit trees in big containers? Okay.
Probably not. I mean, if you can get a very dwarf fruit tree and you have a big, like a planter box, you might be able to keep it alive. And you know, it would almost be bonsai just by having its root space contained. But it's not the ideal conditions for a fruit tree. And I certainly wouldn't just grow them in a pot. I'd say it'd have to be a big planting box.
Okay. And well, this last question is interesting. Honeycrisp whip was planted last year. I'm not sure what she means by Honeycrisp.
Okay, an apple tree. Okay. Now, was it planted?
Well, hang on. The wind snapped the top off. I wrapped it with plastic and it has survived, but there are splits in the bark. What can be applied to the cracks?
Okay. So you shouldn't apply anything, to be honest. The old school was that they put wound paint on, and you know, that was really not a good thing to do. The tree has its own natural defenses. It will try and I forget the acronym for it, but it basically compartmentalizes any wounds. So it builds up defense wood that keeps the wound separate and then doesn't allow any diseases to come through. So you don't want to put anything on it. You certainly, you know, if it's growing above where the damage was, then hopefully, you know, you were able to save it. So you've basically done a graft of the tree itself, and hopefully the wound will heal completely and not be a weak point. Time will tell, unfortunately.
Do we have time for one more question or no?
I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. And so I'll pause to just thank you so much, Marianne. That was such an excellent and really practical session. Will save us all a lot of money, hopefully, the next time we go out and buy a tree. So thank you so much. And and thanks to our audience who joined us today. You can always follow up through our email helpline or our Facebook group if you did want to send in more questions. So please do join us next week when we'll be talking about vertical gardening. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.